Welcome, and thank you for standing by. Currently, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be posted publicly on our website. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host for today, Candace Wilson.
Thank you, Kira. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the March Local Employment Dynamic, or LED, webinar. Before I introduce today's speaker, let's go over a few housekeeping rules. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded. For your convenience, it will be uploaded to our Census Academy website with all supplemental materials relating to the webinar within 30 business days. We welcome your questions during the webinar. Please submit your questions using the Q&A panel, which is located at the bottom right corner of your WebEx screen. Once you've found the Q&A panel, make sure you choose All Panelists from the drop-down menu. This will ensure we see your question. As time allows, we will answer your questions directly through the Q&A panel, or we will share your question with the presenter to respond to during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Also, we ask that you do not include any personal or business identifiable information with your questions. We suggest keeping the chat panel open as we will provide key links and other resources throughout the webinar. Keep in mind, you won't be able to respond to the chat. That is for us to send out links and other resources related to the presentation. As you know, we are in a virtual environment, and sometimes technical difficulties might occur. If you are having issues, try a different browser or consider logging out and coming back into the session. If you are having audio issues, try selecting the computer audio or calling into the webinar via phone. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and Labor Market Information, it is my pleasure to welcome Mark McInerney as he presents the strengths of QWI and administrative data in a small state. This presentation will document advantages that QWI and administrative data generally have compared to survey-based estimates in a small state context. Mark McInerney is an economist and has served as the director of the Center for Workforce Research and Information, or CWRI, for the Maine Department of Labor for the past 5 years. CWRI's core mission is to inform the public about conditions and trends in the workforce. Mark joined CWRI in 2020 after completing his PhD in economics at the University of Connecticut. With that, I hand it over to you, Mark.
Thanks so much. Really happy to be here today, and for all of you in attendance, I hope this is of interest. I'm here today to kind of talk about, on the one hand, the really strong partnership between states and the Census Bureau. So particularly here, I represent the state of Maine, and so I want to talk a little bit about the great partnership between states, specifically our partnership in Maine with the Census Bureau, and some of the great data products that are made available because of that really strong federal-state partnership. And I'm going to focus in particular on one of those data products, which is the quarterly workforce indicators, and contrast that to other data sources that provide information. And in particular, I'm going to kind of focus in on employment demographic information. So employment demographics are really useful in a lot of different contexts. These information are used by constituents that could include researchers, those in the public policy realm, legislators, folks that are workforce and economic development professionals. And so I'm going to talk about the advantages of the quarterly workforce indicators in terms of providing really useful, helpful, accurate employment demographics compared to other measures, which primarily come from surveys, often household-based surveys. And I want to mention as well that the information that I'm presenting here today, all of it is specific to the state of Maine, but for the most part, these information should be available whether nationally, for states and areas, wherever you might be from. But I'm just going to kind of highlight some of what we see in the partnership with Maine specifically. But again, many of the other state partners can benefit from the exact same data infrastructure and data products. So focusing in a little bit on some of the most common uses and data sources for employment demographics, often we use household survey-based measures. And surveys are quite costly to administer. And many survey programs have been unfortunately experiencing declines in response rates. Focusing in on the survey that is most relevant in this case, the current population survey, here's just a little bit of an example of how that's affecting the data. For nationally representative surveys, often when we break those surveys down and look at information for specific areas or specific states, especially in states with small populations, we can often run into issues of small underlying sample sizes that can affect the quality of the estimates from those surveys. So if we focus in on that survey for example, for Maine specific residents, if we look at the sample of the current population survey, that includes about 800 households in a typical monthly survey. And the response rate has been ranging from about 60 to 65% of households actually respond to the monthly current population survey. When we look at those who are in the labor force, we actually collect a lower response rate in Maine for those in the labor force relative to those who are not in the labor force. So when we combine those two, that relatively small sample of residents in Maine and response rates that have been falling over time, that results in an average weight for a respondent in the survey of around 2,000. In other words, a completed interview in the current population survey represents about 2,000 other people with similar characteristics. Whereas if we look at some of the administrative data that we collect, and as part of the Census LED partnership, we collect wage and salary information through our unemployment insurance tax system on behalf of 650,000 distinct workers in a typical quarter. So generally speaking, that information that we collect, that I'll refer to as administrative data, is much more representative. It's much more complete than information that's reported through a household survey like the current population survey. That really is the main advantage of a data product that is built around administrative data through the LED partnership, and in this case, the quarterly workforce indicators in particular. A limitation of many of those administrative data sources is that they might not be as complete. For example, the interviews that are conducted in the current population survey are very comprehensive, very detailed, and collect a lot of information on behalf of each respondent. So there are certain data gaps that many administrative data sets have. But a major advantage of the quarterly workforce indicators in particular is that by combining administrative data from different sources, federal sources, state sources, many of those data gaps can be filled in, and the representativeness of that administrative data collection can be leveraged. So I'm going to focus in a little bit on a measure of employment, and I'm going to contrast what we're observing in the Maine specific data. The household survey-based measure comes from the current population survey. And then in the blue series, I'm looking at employment through the quarterly workforce indicators. So that's primarily coming from employers that are reporting how many employees they have on their payroll, in this case, that are covered by unemployment insurance. And in this chart, I'm just comparing the percent change in employment over the year to assess differences between those two series. So often that household survey-based measure, basically households responding what is their employment status, leading to a measure of employment compared to what are employers reporting. They tend to follow quite closely. But as we see, there can be divergence between the signals that those two series are sending us. So if we look at the change in employment over the year by those two measures, generally, the employer reported information and the administrative data are much smoother and a little bit less volatile from year to year because of the representativeness of that information generally representing a larger segment of the workforce compared to the survey-based measure. And in particular, if we look at the last few years, we actually see a pretty significant gap where when we look at the information that's coming from employers, it would look as though more employment was recovered following the really significant displacement of employment that happened during the recession around the pandemic. If we look at information being reported from employers, it looks like much more employment growth and employment recovery after that pandemic period, especially in 2021 and 2022 occurred compared to the household survey-based measure, which is in the red, which shows that there was an employment recovery in 2021, but then it started to slow down and really lose steam in the years after that. And if this is true at the macro level, so by that I mean, across demographic groups, across industries, that sort of thing, then it must also be true for subgroups of the population. And that might be of particular interest, again, to policymakers or researchers who are interested in understanding the impact of a recession like the one that started in 2020. So here is one example of how those, the data sources might be telling us a little bit of a different story based on what measure we look at. So this is looking specifically at the workforce between the ages of 45 and 54. The blue measure tells us the employment coming from the quarterly workforce indicator. So in particular, what we're looking at is the number of jobs that are held by workers age 45 to 54 as a share of the population. So how many people are there in that age demographic? And the red series is primarily based on surveys. So the employment to population ratio of folks in that age 45 to 54 cohort based on the household survey measure. So when we compare those two series, one thing that is definitely worth highlighting is that they measure different things. So we do see the current population survey measure is higher. And one reason is it captures a broader measure of employment. In particular, it covers self-employment, which might not be coming in through our administrative unemployment insurance wage records. But I might be interested not just in the conceptual differences between these two data sources, but I might be interested more in the trends, what's happening to this group over time, or which groups have been most affected in the most recent data, for example, by the pandemic and job displacement that occurred around the pandemic. The quarterly workforce indicators tells us that this group, workers age 45 to 54, saw really significant employment declines during the two recessions in the 2000s, the one that started in 2008, the Great Recession, and then again in 2020 around the pandemic. But the quarterly workforce indicators tells us that 45 to 54 group experienced an employment recovery, and that by 2022, 2023, employment had fully recovered, and actually a higher share were employed compared to the years leading up to the pandemic. Whereas looking at the data from the current population survey, we see that the employment recovery is a little bit bumpier, and actually the survey-based measure tells us that there was an additional decline in employment in the years after the pandemic in 2023, and then it recovered a little bit. If we looked over a longer period of time, kind of asking the question, is a higher share of this group employed, or is a lower share of this group employed over time? The quarterly workforce indicators would tell us that employment generally over many years has been rising for the 45 to 54 group, whereas the household survey-based measure would tell us that it's falling modestly over time. And so this is an example where I think the representativeness and the advantage of the quarterly workforce indicators, combining different administrative data sources, can tell us a little bit more of a clear, comprehensive picture about what's happening with this group. With QWI, we could break it down even further. We could look at subsets of this population. This is just one example, looking at age 45 to 54 employment among women. And looking at the more recent years, we see that the quarterly workforce indicators tells us that there was, of course, a displacement of employment around the pandemic, and then an unemployment recovery that happened thereafter. Whereas the household survey-based measure would say that there was, a more significant displacement of employment that occurred during the pandemic, some recovery in the years after, but then another fall in employment in 2023 that we don't see in the QWI. And similar for that same age demographic, but among men, we see a smoother employment recovery in the years after the pandemic that kind of continued on into 2023 and 2024, which is not the same trend that we see if we look at the household survey measure. But a problem here is that, thinking about that sample size that I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, when we break that down further into age cohorts or other demographic groups, that sample of survey respondents just becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, whereas the quarterly workforce indicators really benefits from the representativeness of the administrative data. So those are some of the great advantages and one of the reasons that as a LED partner state, we really try to leverage and make folks aware of the great data products that are made available, and the QWI in particular, which creates really robust data products by combining data from many different sources. Some great news in terms of the QWI and some improvements in the years ahead is that there are plans to incorporate, as I mentioned right now, state unemployment insurance wage records primarily do not collect information about self-employment. It's collecting information mostly about wage and salary employment, but the economists and other staff at the Census Bureau are working to incorporate information about self-employment to make a more complete data source of employment that might include earnings from wage and salary employment, self-employment, or some workers that combine earnings from both of those sources. Of course, there are some limitations to the LEHD data. That one in particular is that because all these data sources being combined have specific confidentiality protections in place, the state partners that participate in this data sharing partnership can't necessarily receive back the combined data. So if we had information about workers and it was combined with self-employment earnings or demographic characteristics that came back from another source, each of those data sources has their own data protection, so we can't necessarily just receive back the combined microdata that combines information from all of those various different sources because of the protections on it. As well, administrative data are not always collected in a way that aligns with a particular topic or research question. So I'll provide the example of the minimum wage. For the most part, state unemployment insurance wage records collect information about a worker's total earnings during a particular reference quarter. And that might not align with a research project or question about the minimum wage, which might want to ask questions about how many workers are receiving the minimum wage, how many hours did they work, how their hours are changing over time, et cetera, because many of those data elements, like the worker's pay rate, whether or not they're paid the minimum wage, how many hours they worked, those types of data elements are just not collected in the administrative data. And so using administrative data are limited by how the data are collected, what data elements are included, et cetera. So in that case, a much more comprehensive data collection method like the current population survey goes into a lot more detail and collects a lot more data elements than sometimes we can leverage in administrative data sources. One of the things that the quarterly workforce indicators and other LED products do to try to create more complete measures based on the often somewhat limited information that's collected on administrative data is by using really sophisticated, clever methodologies to try to create more complete, more comprehensive measures. So as I mentioned, most wage records only collect information about the total earnings during a particular quarter, not necessarily how many hours somebody worked, or when in the quarter somebody might have either started or perhaps they left that job. We just don't know. That can be a challenge when you're looking at earnings information because you don't necessarily know whether somebody was employed full-time during that quarter, whether they started a job at some point during the quarter, whether they left the quarter. You might be looking at partial earnings information rather than earnings that are reflective of employment throughout that particular reference period. And one way that the quarterly workforce indicators overcomes this and creates more complete measures of all the dynamics that occur within the labor market is by looking at the relationship between workers and employers. So, for example, the quarterly workforce indicators measures whether somebody was employed in a particular point in time and whether that employment relationship is new or whether that employee was employed in the quarter before that and the quarter after that. If there was a continuous employment relationship, then that would tell us that it's really likely that that particular worker was employed throughout that quarter rather than starting a job at some point in that quarter, or perhaps leaving the job or maybe being laid off from that job during the quarter. And another way this some of these tools and techniques used by the QWI can create more complete, more comprehensive looks at local labor markets was developed by Bailey and Spletzer in a 2020 paper that used that measure of employment happening throughout the quarter to develop a new measure of multiple job holding, which can distinguish between job transitions. So, for example, if we see somebody that has two employers at a particular point in time, they might have left one employer and joined a new employer versus those that are very likely to have held both jobs at the same time simultaneously. Somebody who had stable employment or full quarter employment and a second job that might have been observed in the data, it's much more likely that that person was working those two jobs simultaneously compared to, transitioning from one job to another. And so in these ways, the quarterly workforce indicators and some of the other data products available through the Local Employment Dynamics Partnership can create new and more comprehensive ways to look at all the dynamics that occur within the labor market. So here's one example where, once again, the current population survey can ask really detailed questions of people about their earnings, whether they have multiple jobs or not, and that can allow us to track the rate at which job holders might be holding multiple jobs in our labor market. And here, that measure from the current population survey is documented in red. And then in the blue series, we're using that measure from the Bailey and Spletzer paper, using the QWI full quarter job measure to track the share of our workforce that are working multiple jobs according to our administrative data. And again, we see mostly these two series are following a similar trend, but when we use the administrative data, it's much smoother. And it tells us a little bit of a different story about the impact of the recession, in this case, looking at the 2020 recession, when there was a lot of employment, a lot of job holders being displaced from a job that affected multiple job holders as well. And we saw the multiple job holding rate in the state fall from about 8% to a little below 7% or so. But then we see during that period of employment recovery, as many groups were experiencing employment recovery, so too we saw that multiple job holder rate increase to, by 2024, a quite similar rate to what it was in the years just before the pandemic. And the household survey-based data from the current population survey mostly tells us a similar story, though it does look like that rate fell once again in 2024, which is a little bit different than what we see in the administrative data. We can also get much more detail by looking at administrative data because we can kind of look at not just the rate at which people might be holding multiple jobs. We can assess what industry are they deriving their primary earnings from, what industry are they deriving their secondary earnings from, as well as seasonal factors. We can get into much more detail about multiple job holders. One question that came up in terms of constituents here and workforce development policy in the state was, whether multiple job holders were a group that might benefit from workforce development or targeted employment services. And so, one question was, how do earnings of multiple job holders compare to, the average worker? How do we see, differences in terms of industries that multiple job holders are working in? And when we looked at the data here in Maine, we actually found that the largest group of multiple job holders were earning their primary income in the healthcare and social assistance field. And, on average, they were earning somewhat above average earnings from multiple jobs compared to a job holder that on average might have like a single job. And then we saw a group of other, multiple job holders that had lower earnings in the educational services, leisure and hospitality, and retail trade sector that, might be more of a group that could benefit from either workforce development or targeted employment services to the extent that multiple job holders might want to transition to a higher paying sector. One of the great things about the different measures of employment developed by the quarterly workforce indicators is that it can really speak to the dynamic environment of the labor market, documenting, which workers have a tenure with their employer that might last for multiple quarters versus those that either started or might have been separated from a job during a particular point in time. For those that might be familiar with Maine and our labor market and some of the places in Maine that many people like to come and visit, you might know it as vacation land. We actually have a really highly seasonal labor market. And when we look at, for example, the total employment in the state and how it might vary between, winter lows when some industries can be affected by cold weather, certain types of economic activity might, come to a halt completely compared to summer when many tourists are visiting the state. There's many more bookings in hotels and people taking advantage of outdoor recreation. We actually see that employment can vary about 6 to 7% between those winter lows and those summer highs. And so data products like the QWI can really paint a more complete picture of all the dynamics that underlie the labor market. And this might also be of interest from a workforce development perspective for folks that are providing employment services, helping folks to reach either a new step in their career ladder or perhaps more stability in their employment, higher earnings, et cetera. And so, one of the things that we've been trying to do here in Maine is to, really leverage a lot of the great work that's been done to create data products like the quarterly workforce indicators and try to leverage that for other purposes as well. And so I'm just going to kind of, to close out, talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done to try to kind of replicate some of those measures and then combine them with our efforts to assess workforce development programs and investments in the state. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which is intended to help job seekers access education, training, or other support services to help realize labor market opportunities. And it's also intended to help employers connect with a skilled local workforce. In Maine, we have been trying to assess the outcomes of participants in these workforce programs by looking at their employment prior to enrollment in the program and then after they complete services within those programs, and getting a more complete measure using some of those QWI definitions, with the motivation being that upward mobility is much more likely through employment stability and is much less likely through either high turnover or shorter duration employment. Some of the more traditional measures of effectiveness of these programs are often a snapshot at a particular point in time, looking at, for example, the employment rate of participants in the second quarter after exit, or the median earnings of participants in the second quarter after exit, which might not provide a complete picture about things like stability of employment or duration of employment. And again, whether some of those folks might have partial earnings during the quarter, or whether they're in a more stable employment relationship. So by combining that with information about participants in Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs, we have used some of the tools that were developed for the quarterly workforce indicators. And we used 3 different measures of employment that try to, again, fully leverage. On the one hand, we're getting limited information about workers. We want to develop a more complete picture. And so part of what we're doing is leveraging all the information that we do have available through administrative data sources. And again, some of the methodology, some of the tools that were developed with the QWI. So as a broadest measure of employment among participants in Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act programs, we might just ask, well, what share have any employment record? So our broadest measure would just say, what if somebody has a matching employment record within the state, we're going to classify them as employed, regardless of when they might have started that employment, regardless of how much they might be earning. The second measure we're going to use is the one from the quarterly workforce indicators, looking specifically at full quarter employment. So looking at employment that an employment relationship that existed in the quarter before and the quarter after, telling us that there was a continuous, most likely continuous employment between that employer and that employee. And that's going to, again, help us to exclude if somebody started a job maybe late in the quarter, they might only have partial earnings information. And that might not be a good reflection of the outcomes because somebody might have just started that job, right at the end of the quarter as one example. And then finally, I mentioned that we don't necessarily know by looking at somebody's wage records alone if they are working part-time, if they're working full-time, what their hourly pay rate is, if they're working in a salaried job, et cetera. But we can use that earnings information at least as a proxy to say, well, if you're earning above a certain amount, it's much more likely or it's highly likely that you're working in a full-time job. So we use as a threshold the state's minimum wage and assume that if somebody's working more than 32 hours per week during the entire 13 weeks of that quarter, according to their earnings, it's much more likely that that person is going to be working full-time than not. And so here are our different measures. Our broadest measure is the blue employment rate, just looking at anybody that had employment rate before or after. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at outcome quarters, that is the quarter relative to when somebody enrolled in a Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act program. In this case, we're looking at those in the adult program. In the quarters leading up would be, quarters, for example, -6, -4 would be about a year before enrolling. And then the positive quarters would be after somebody completed services, how did their employment trajectory change? And so when you look across all of these measures, we see increases of about employment rates increasing by about 16 to 18 percentage points after somebody has completed these workforce development services. And our red measure there shows the share that had stable, continuous employment in that time. So we see, a pretty significant increase, and then nearly half the participants, after completing services, have stable employment according to the QWI measure. We can also look at how earnings vary based on, what type of employment we observe. So the blue measure shows us that, there is an earnings increase among those who participated in a Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act program after they completed those services, but their earnings are less than those who had that stable employment, the full quarter job measure. In our red series, we're looking at the median earnings among those who have full quarter employment before and after participating in the program. And by all these measures, we see, fairly significant earnings increases, but higher earnings among those that had full quarter stable earnings. And then finally, another thing that we can do with administrative data is, look across the earnings distribution. So we can say, is this specific to those that are in lower earning fields, higher earning fields, or who are in the middle in terms of the earnings distribution? So now we're looking at those that had full quarter employment, but we're looking at the earnings of the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile or the median, and then the 75th percentile representing the more of the higher income earners. We see pretty similar increases in earnings across the distribution, low, middle, and high income earners, using that measure of full employment, full quarter employment, pretty significant earnings increases after folks participated in these programs. Just wanted to share kind of a few takeaways. Hope it was a helpful, informative presentation for you all, and I appreciate your patience. That survey measures like the current population survey continue to offer really critical information for many constituents, for policymakers, workforce and economic development professionals, for researchers. These survey instruments collect the most detailed, the most comprehensive information to really understand topics like employment and how demographic groups might be experiencing different trends in employment or the factors that might be preventing employment, et cetera. A challenge for those that are looking at area or state and area specific data is that for many of those nationally representative survey programs, if you're looking at state or area level data and then you're looking at specific groups or segments of the workforce, that can result in some really small sample sizes in those survey programs, which can lead to more fluctuation and some lower quality estimates when you're breaking down that sample size even further. One of the great advantages of administrative data and the data products like the quarterly workforce indicators and others in the LED partnership is that they combine administrative data from a variety of different sources. They are able to take advantage of the representativeness that those administrative data sets often collect information from a much more comprehensive, much larger group. And each one of those data sources on its own has many data gaps or limitations, but by combining administrative data from different sources, many of those gaps can be filled in. That's one of the great things about using the QWI and why we try to make sure that all of our data users are aware of the great data products like the QWI. Sometimes those methodological gaps, methodological tools can help to overcome some of those data gaps. That information might not be collected in a specific way, but you can use a methodology to try to estimate or hone in on a particular group or topic if it might not be collected in that way in the administrative data. So these are some of the really great things that you can do that we admire and benefit from as a partner in the LED. And with that, again, thanks all. And I believe we will be turning to Q&A next.
Thank you, Mark. Before we get to the questions, as a reminder, the presentation will be accessible on the Census Academy website at census.gov/academy under the webinar within 30 days. The links have been added to the chat. Again, please type all of your questions in the Q&A box and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees. First question. I'm developing a modular workforce housing modules aligned with apprenticeship pipelines, particularly in construction and event-driven economies. Are there any data sets within QWI or LEHD that track workforce retention relative to housing stability or commute distance?
That's a great question. I'm not sure whether any single data product might capture all of that, but I do think that combined some of the QWI measures and other LED products in combination might be able to really help with that. So on the one hand, the On the Map product is a really wonderful tool that we didn't even really have time this afternoon to delve into. On the Map can provide information about workforce as it pertains to geography based on location of jobs, location of workforce, and to really hone in on the commuting patterns of where people are coming from, where they're commuting to, and that sort of thing. The quarterly workforce indicators can really help you hone in on specific areas and specific industries. So, for example, looking at the construction sector or other industries that might be of interest, and some of those measures that I mentioned in the QWI that help to understand the dynamics of an industry. One measure is the turnover measure from the QWI. You can use that turnover measure to assess retention or the extent to which that workforce might be turning over. And I believe that information, again, could be overlaid with commuting information from on the map and information about housing and house prices and that sort of thing, affordability of housing in certain areas, which it should be available from other data products, but can be combined, again, as I mentioned, with data like on the map and turnover from quarterly workforce indicators for areas, sectors, that in combination, I think, could really get at some of those questions. Absolutely.
Are there indicators in QWI showing post-recovery employment instability tied to geographic displacement or housing pressure?
Again, a great question. I don't think that the QWI themselves have information about, for example, changes in the local housing market or housing prices or housing pressure, things of that nature. But I do believe that the QWI data are available for states and areas, the majority of states that are partnership in the LED partnership. And that information could be tied together with information from other sources about, for example, changes in housing prices or vacancy rates or the proportion of income that goes towards housing in certain areas, et cetera, that come from other data sources that I think together with QWI could help to paint a fairly comprehensive picture of differences in employment recovery.
Could part of the CPS QWI divergence reflect structural barriers like housing instability or workforce development rather than just labor supply changes?
That's a good question. There are different reasons that we might see some of the divergence. Some of it could be coming from different ways that the data are being collected that might lead us to some of those differences. So again, information within the QWI, the primary basis for employment is information that's reported by employers. So employers are primarily reporting information, and that's based on the location of the job itself. Whereas information from the current population survey is primarily coming from households. Households are responding, based on their experiences in the household, based on where they might be located, regardless, their residency, regardless of where they may be working. So there are some conceptual differences. But again, if you're looking at specific, subgroups of the workforce, specific geographic areas, that nationally representative current population survey, sometimes you can be looking at smaller and smaller and smaller samples. And so sometimes what we're seeing might not be reflective of what's happening broadly among a group, but it might come down to the fact that when you break down a sample into smaller and smaller and smaller sample sizes, sometimes the respondents, their experiences might not be representative of a broader group of the population. So it could be that those conceptual coverage differences, the way that the data are collecting, are explaining some of the divergences as well. Sometimes if you're just looking at a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller sample, sometimes the information collected from that maybe smaller group isn't as representative of a larger segment of the population.
This is interesting. On the slide, why is the CPS line on the graph so up and down and not as smooth as the QWI line?
Right. So on the one hand, some of the series that I was displaying from the current population survey, they are only available sometimes as an annual average, right? So because the underlying sample might be smaller, those data might not be available, either monthly or quarterly. They might only be available as an annual average, whereas the quarterly workforce indicators are available quarterly. So sometimes there is a difference just between the frequency that the data are made available, but as well, when you're breaking down a survey into smaller and smaller subgroups, sometimes the estimates can fluctuate from year to year because of the small underlying sample, and not necessarily because of, say, a change in economic circumstances or the change in the experience of a particular group. Sometimes that small sample size can lead to fluctuations up and down from one year to the next. Whereas within the quarterly workforce indicators, the smoothness of many of the data series, I think, is mostly reflective of the fact that the data are really representative. They represent a larger segment of the workforce, and because they're combining information from administrative records, they tend to be more comprehensive, just representative of a larger segment of the workforce compared to the survey-based measure. Another factor is that, if you think about information that's reported by household, if you're reporting information about your own household, you might be reporting information about yourself, you might be reporting information about other adults in your household. It's probably only a few people, whereas information that's reported from employers, that could represent dozens, it could represent hundreds, it could even represent thousands of workers. And it's comprehensive in that, through tax filings and through other sources. It's not necessarily a sample-based estimate, but often, those are more comprehensive, like the state unemployment insurance wage records are capturing, really everybody that's covered by unemployment insurance in that particular state that you might be, looking at the data. So often the smoothness is because they're, much more representative, collecting more information about a larger segment of the workforce.
If the 45 to 54 age group is more likely to hold one full-time job than others, this would explain the difference in levels. And the convergence between the two groups could suggest that the more 45 to 54-year-olds are making ends meet by holding several part-time jobs. Have you considered this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's another one of the key conceptual differences between, for example, the current population survey and the quarterly workforce indicators, is that multiple job holders can appear multiple times. In many jobs measures, multiple job holders can appear multiple times. We've investigated this by, again, using the Bailey and Spletzer method of multiple job holding rates. And so we're looking at the extent to which is multiple job holding becoming more prevalent, is it becoming less prevalent? And if, as we saw, at least in the Maine specific data, following the pandemic, the multiple job holding rate had rebounded, and it was really similar to the pre-pandemic years, 2017, 18, 19 range or so. So I believe that it's more likely the case that, it has to do with the differences in the quality of the measures rather than a fundamental change, a certain group, being much more likely to hold multiple jobs. We're seeing really similar trends in terms of multiple job holding rates now compared to, the years before the pandemic, for example.
Are the lines smoothing the values from the data calculated from the low smoothing, rather?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I will say that in some instances, some of the series that I presented have, quarterly observations and an annual average kind of presented at the same time. Some of that just being within Maine, the labor market is really seasonal. There's a lot of fluctuation from summer to winter, for example. So I might have missed something about that question. If that's not a comprehensive answer, please feel free to follow up.
Recognizing the challenges with small state math, in the case of Maine, has Census looked across Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont to determine if CPS moves and is closer to QWI across the three states, applicable where demographics are common across the state borders?
That's a great question. I think in general that it was actually the case in many states in New England, in the Northeast region, that the employment recovery, according to the CPS data, appeared to be somewhat more muted, not as not as robust or happening as swiftly compared to information that was coming from employers through surveys, through administrative data. I think it was actually a challenge that was observed in the state data in many states in the region.
32 hours per week is assumed in the Maine QWI program. How does this reconcile with the federal OEWS program, which defines full-time or FT employment as 35 hours?
So I should say that measure is not a measure within the quarterly workforce indicators. It's a measure that we're using in Maine, and it's just as a proxy. It's not intended to replace OEWS data. It's really just a proxy for trying to differentiate people that are more likely to be working full-time, people that are less likely to be working full-time. And again, we don't know how many hours, if we're just looking at wage records, we don't know how many hours somebody's working. We don't know the wage rate that they're working at. Whether they are in fact earning the minimum wage, whether they're earning a minimum wage, a wage higher than the minimum wage, whether they took a week of unpaid leave during that quarter. We don't know any of these things. It's really just a kind of an arbitrary threshold to say people earning above this threshold are much more likely to be working in a full-time job. People earning below this threshold are less likely to be working in a full-time job. So it's really just an arbitrary threshold that's intended to be helpful. There's probably, you can make a case for using a different threshold, I'm sure.
How can I combine QWI of NAICS and ACS data to drill down in areas where I want to explore? Is this even possible?
Well, through the QWI, you can get industry information, including the sector of the employer, as well as the more detailed industries within the employer. I wouldn't necessarily say it can be combined with ACS information per se, but I think you can look at areas, or you can look at topics and compare QWI and ACS based measures for sure. If you want a more complete picture, I think that's one of the takeaways that I think that I would definitely try to pass on to folks, is that looking at any one source of information might not be enough. Where possible, I would say certainly try to look at multiple sources of information if it is possible, to leverage multiple different data sources to get more of a complete picture, because sometimes one data source alone might not tell you the complete picture.
So glad you're discussing WIOA, wage and employment retention performance measures. It can also be challenging to track these earnings, and know if they were retaining the same job that they started out, or had a time that they exited the WIOA service, or if they've entered employment in one job and then possibly lost their job or moved on to a different job by the second or fourth quarter after exiting WIOA services.
I appreciate the feedback. I agree. I think that using some of the tools like those developed in the QWI can tell us a more complete, more comprehensive picture. It definitely does require having knowledge of and having some kind of a data infrastructure to be able to look at data longitudinally. That is, looking at the experiences of for example, a WIOA participant before and after, as well as the relationship with an employer before and after. It does require a level of technical expertise and data infrastructure to be able to do so. So it is challenging. But I think that, using some of the methods from QWI and other LED programs can help create a more comprehensive picture of the employment trajectories of folks that participate in programs like WIOA.
To clarify, is a recommendation to generally use the CPS and then look into the QWI for any gaps if we're looking for more rural communities where the sample size are few?
Well, I would say between the two different data products, there are going to be certain information that are available from the current population survey that can be compared to the quarterly workforce indicators, but there are, of course, other measures that are not possible to reconstruct or compare to the quarterly workforce indicators. And so the current population survey is the primary measure of unemployment rates for the nation, for states and areas, et cetera. And it's not necessarily possible to compare, the unemployment rate of an area from the current population survey or the local area unemployment statistics to an equivalent measure from the QWI, because QWI does not have a complete set of information about unemployment. So it's not always possible to align the two data sources to compare one to the other. But there are some instances that I think, and from the example here this afternoon, looking at the employment, maybe how a certain group might have been affected by a recession or longer term trends in employment. I do think it's helpful to compare, if it's possible, to compare what is the trend from the current population survey to what does the quarterly workforce indicators tell us. So where those two data products do align, I think there are a lot of advantages to using the quarterly workforce indicators. But again, it depends on what is the topic, what is the question that you're really pursuing.
The CPS data collected. Are surveys conducted via phone, mail, email? I'm curious if caller ID and cell phones have degraded the response rate and therefore the accuracy of the data. QWI makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. Primarily, the current population survey has relied on in-person data collection, so interviewers that are physically going to homes to collect information, as well as telephone collection. There is a pilot project, I believe, within the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics to modernize and to develop an electronic data collection instrument for the current population survey that hopefully is going to be coming in the years ahead. But I agree that I think overall, whether we're talking about employer surveys, household surveys, really across the board, it is an increasingly difficult data collection environment. Many surveys, not just the current population survey, have experienced that difficulty, that challenging data collection environment, have been experiencing falling response rates. And some of that is from increasing skepticism, or people that are receiving fraudulent phone calls, increasingly things of that nature that it makes it difficult for data collectors who are serving the public to be able to produce this information, to stand out in a world where we're getting increasingly spam and fraudulent phone calls and things of that nature that make us just on average more suspicious, or less likely to answer the phone or provide personal information or things of that nature.
Mark, building on your point about combining data sources, what is the best way to practically link QWI outcomes with on-the-map commuting patterns at a local level?
Well, that's a great question. If you are interested in a specific geographic area, that area could be the link. So if you're interested in a city, a town, a county, a workforce investment area, et cetera, right? So one way that you could link those two is with that area. But otherwise, I think it depends again on what is it that you're hoping to learn from the data, what is the topic, what is the subject. So you could be comparing, demographic groups. You could be comparing industries, specific geographic regions. So I think it depends somewhat on the topic. But if you were interested in a particular area, like a county, I think a really complete way to look at that would be to look at the commuting patterns within that county, inflows and outflows of workforce, as well as the demographics of the workforce from QWI, things like that.
Are there funding opportunities for workforce development agencies within the coffers of the WIOA? If so, how are these notices disseminated to the public?
That's a great question. That's, I think, somewhat outside of my subject matter expertise. Generally, I think funds through WIOA are administered by the U.S. Department of Labor, and to states and areas within the states. States have their own ways of organizing programs and funding within the WIOA program. But I am definitely not an expert. I don't, manage services within that program or anything like that. We just try to partner with our employment services and rehabilitation services folks here in Maine to try to help them, really dig into the data underlying participant outcomes and things of that nature. But I am not a subject matter expert in terms of how funding are organized or funding opportunities or anything like that, unfortunately.
Any idea why response rates have decreased in the CPS in recent years?
My best guess is what I just described, that overall it's becoming a more challenging data collection environment over time. So it's not unique to household-based surveys. It's also true of employer-based surveys, and it's not unique to the United States. It's something that's occurring in many kind of similar countries that have similar income per capita or things of that nature. It's not unique to the United States. I think part of it is from sophistication of fraudsters, the prevalence of spam phone calls, and just generally being folks being more guarded or more suspicious when either they receive a phone call or a letter or a request for information. Unfortunately, I think fraud is becoming more sophisticated over time, and that's making us put up barriers and making us more hesitant to share information, and just overall maybe less trustworthy and less likely overall to participate in the survey, perhaps.
The lag time between collection of QWI data and public reporting of this data?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
Sure. What is the lag time between collection of QWI data and public reporting of this data?
So there is a pretty significant lag time. So the basis of QWI, the quarterly, at least from the state data, the quarterly employer and wage records that states collect, that tends to be lagged by about 4 to 6 months in terms of when that data become published and publicly available. But there's a further lag in that through the LED partnership. There's data collection that's happening at the state level, data collection that's happening at the federal level. That information is combined, and so I think on average, the data publication of the quarterly workforce indicators tends to be a little bit further behind, but I ballpark maybe 6 months or so would be, or a little bit longer would be the typical lag, I think, for the publication of the QWI.
How often is QWI data published? Quarterly, half year, or annual?
QWI are published quarterly.
At what level of NAICS industry level is QWI data reported?
That is a great question. I think that's something that is also changing. I know that economists and other staff at the Census Bureau are working to publish more detailed industry level. So I would have to double check.
I can jump in there, Mark.
Yeah.
So we recently had in February a webinar regarding the quarterly workforce indicators, NAICS 5 and 6. So now we have NAICS 5 and 6 in the QWI Explorer.
Perfect. Whereas it had been 4, I think, before that, but now 5 and 6 are available. So great.
Correct.
Does QWI data represent employment and wage data based on where workers live or based on where workers work, where the jobs are?
great question. So I believe it is based on where the jobs are, but another product, the on the map product, is representative both of place of residency and place of work. So if you were really more interested in both aspects, I would recommend going to the on the map data product, which can help to understand commuting patterns and location of jobs, where the workforce are coming from, or if you're interested in the workforce that are commuting out of a particular area, things of that nature. Definitely would recommend going to the on the map data product.
Thank you. That concludes the Q&A portion of this webinar. Now, Arlene.
Thank you, Tanja. This concludes the March LED webinar. Join us on April 15 at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time when Joshua Bleiberg presents Exploring Inequitable Trends in Education Staff Turnover. Before we go, Mark, would you like to make any closing remarks?
Thanks again all for attending, for your participation, for your interest, and I'm glad that folks are aware of the wealth of information and the really high quality data products through the LED or through your local labor market information shop. So encourage all to take advantage of the wealth of information through these data programs.
I too want to say thank you to you, Mark. Thank you so much for your presentation and your very thoughtful answers to the questions. So we would like to also invite you to the 2026 LED Partnership Hybrid Workshop on May 12th through the 13th from noon to 5 p.m. each day. Go to lehd.ces.census.gov and click on the Workshops Webinars tab for more information. That's actually where we had Mark present for the first time on this topic. Upon exiting this webinar, you will receive a pop-up to an evaluation. We would appreciate that you take the time to answer the questions so we may better serve you in the future webinars. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.